I think there really is a group that certainly does participate in and believe in these, what I would consider to be wacky, magical beliefs about the energies that they can get through child sacrifice and what have you.
So thank you, James. Thanks for coming on to this show. How would you describe to people that don't know you the work that you do?
I guess the easiest way to understand it is that it is everything. It is everything I want to talk about at the time I want to talk about it. It is news, it is politics, it is society, it is culture, it is history, it is philosophy, it is science, it is absolutely anything else I want to talk about. It is a podcast, it is a vodcast, it is articles, it is interviews. So it's 15 years of media content that is available completely for free for people who haven't checked me out yet. It's at CorbettReport.com.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of your work. Like you said, you touch on a lot of things. I'm going to try to touch on your philosophy here in the end. But I wanted to pick up for people that saw my last interview with G. Edward Griffin. I talked to him about money, and he kind of the last part that we mentioned was the fractional reserve lending. And we didn't really get to talk about, I wanted to talk about central banks. So I'm going to ask you, I think you know a lot about that. What are the dangers of having a central bank in a society?
So a central bank, especially as it has been set up for your American listeners in the U.S., it's a cartel that is being operated by the banks. And specifically in the case of the Federal Reserve in the United States, it was set up in 1913 as a cartel run by, owned by, operated by the very banks that are supposedly being regulated by this system. But they are, in fact, the Federal Reserve is a weird system of centralized/decentralized control. That's the way they frame it. And there's a board of governors, and they like to have the fig leaf of, oh, the chairman is appointed by the president. So it's kind of this creation of Congress. But as the Federal Reserve says, as Alan Greenspan says, no other agency of government can override any action that we take. We are not beholden to government. And although, yes, I guess there is the sort of the charter that was signed off on by the Congress and had to be renewed every 20 years, but then they got rid of that, and it never has to be renewed ever again. It will keep going until Congress actually abolishes it. And the whole thing came about really in 1907. There was this big crash, this panic that took place on Wall Street that may or may not have been precipitated by J.P. Morgan. People who want that story can look into my hour-and-a-half long documentary on the subject, Century of Enslavement, the History of the Federal Reserve. But basically, this panic made people wonder, oh, what will government do about this? Please come in and save us. And so the very banksters that were supposedly going to be regulated and controlled by this new creation of government got together on Jekyll Island off of the coast of Georgia in 1910 to come up with a plan that eventually became essentially the Federal Reserve Act. It went through some permutations. The original plan that they forwarded got exposed as being, hey, this is a bankster plan. So they had to abandon that one and then pass it under another name. But basically, it became the Federal Reserve. And it is a cartel that is these 12 regional banks that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Federal Reserve Bank of Illinois, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, whatever. There are 12 of them scattered across the U.S., but they are private banks. In fact, they've even argued that in court, as they argued over a decade ago when the Federal Reserve was being sued for freedom of information, under freedom of information, for information about the bailout, the billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars in the 2008 bailout, and we want to get more information about that. They were sued over it by, I believe, Bloomberg, and they had to argue in court, hey, we're not a government agency. We're a private bank, so you can't sue us for that information. So that is what this is. It is a cartel. And until people understand that, they won't understand that the entire banking system, including the money creation system as it exists and is functioning now, is almost entirely, almost exclusively, except for the coins in your pocket that are minted by the mint. And I suppose the Treasury supposedly issues the Federal Reserve notes that are in your pocket. But again, that's Federal Reserve imprimatur. That is all of the money that's circulating that has nothing to do with the banks. The rest of it is created out of debt owed back to the banksters at interest. The government gives them the power to create the money out of debt. And from that system, you have what we see today, which is a system of people being essentially enslaved by debt to the banksters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned that I liked your work because you kind of summarize all these topics and it's all on your website. You could even like go corbettreport.com slash like World War One or WW1 and you'll get like the topic. So if people want to learn more about these things in depth, I recommend you call it open source. What is it? Open source.
Open source. Well, it's called open source intelligence news. This is open source intelligence, essentially, which was actually coined, as far as I know, by the CIA. Many years ago, they said, most of the actual information that we get isn't from James Bond sleuths and secret spy satellites. It's from listening to Russian radio or reading, Mexican newspapers or whatever it is. It's all out there, or not all, but a lot of it is out there these days. And I figured, well, if they can do it, so can we. So why not?
Mm-hmm. So I was gonna try to touch on who actually owns the Federal Reserve today. Is that something that we could see, or is it like private?
So as I said, the 12 regional banks that make up the Federal Reserve System are private banks, and they are owned by the banks that themselves are part of that Federal Reserve System. They essentially the bank holders are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve in that sense, and they do get paid a dividend because the Federal Reserve makes money for creating money for the Treasury. They make money out of that proposition, but don't worry, they send it all back to the Treasury. So they're not. It's not a money making business. Oh, but they do keep 6% for their dividend for their shareholders, which are the private banks. So there's that aspect of the scam. But the more fundamental aspect of the scam is, I think people get hung up on the word ownership and what that means and shareholders or something like that. But it's more about the power to create money and to direct those flow of funds. That is the power. And whether that power comes from some sort of, ownership deed, or whether that comes from the fact that, oh, our man is at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and he can dictate where hundreds of billions of dollars in bailout money is going, that seems to be more the operative part of it. The real question is who holds the power of the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I guess. And who decides those things? Like, I've heard of the Federal Reserve just giving money to countries and just like printing money out of nothing. Like who makes those decisions? And I guess
Yeah.
my deeper question was like, who owns the majority of the wealth? I was gonna mention like families, but I don't know if that's the proper route.
Right, of course. And in that regard, of course, people are going to talk about families like the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Rockefellers. I mean, one thing I've done a lot of work on the Rockefellers. I did my big oil documentary, and I thought it was interesting how the Rockefellers went from oil into banking, and the Rothschilds went from banking into oil. I mean, any way that you can monopolize or carve out a piece of an incredibly important resource like that, whether it be energy or money, obviously it's going to be a draw for vested interests that want to preserve their wealth. And I think there is something to that. And there are the Lazards and other names that certainly have been around for a long time, intergenerationally in the banking world. But I think, again, there's a rotating cast of characters that come in and out of these positions. And I think if people get hung up on the idea that it's all being controlled by a certain family or something along those lines, I think they miss the deeper picture of this, which is, okay, so if that's the case, then we just kill everyone in that family and the world will be all magically better overnight. No, reality does not work that way. It is about an ideology. It is about an ideology of control. People who genuinely believe they deserve to rule over other people, to create money for the benefit of themselves, their families, and their friends. That is the system that we're trying to really topple here, and that's something that has to be done from the conscious perspective. I think we need a conscious revolution in order to not make a system whereby if we take out the people who happen to be sitting in those particular positions of power today, there'd be a million people who would love to step into those positions tomorrow. We have to create the conditions so that those positions, A, don't exist, and B, people don't want to step into those positions of power, because I genuinely believe the world it would not only be sort of better in some sort of moral sense, although I think that too, obviously, but really it would function much, much better for humanity as a whole if we did not have these positions of centralized power. Because as people like Hayek and others have elaborated at great length in the past, people who believe that they can control society and control the actions that people are taking, control their transactions, control their interactions, try to centrally plan everything, are hindering humanity, not helping it. Because the real beauty and wisdom of humanity comes through people pursuing their own ends independently and interacting in whatever way they see fit to create the society that becomes infinitely more complex than any central planner could even comprehend, let alone actually manage.
Yeah, so would you say that the people who have this desire to control other people and just feel that they're better, do they hide behind the government, which is, I know you're an anarchist, so is the government kind of the way they managed to pull this off? Oh yeah.
I am definitely an anarchist. Yes. Yes, exactly right. Government has to be seen for what it is, which is a trough of power. And who goes to feed at the trough of power? All the pigs. Now, it's extremely easy for us to say, oh, look at all those pigs. They're the ones, and they're the problem. But I think people should really need to step back and really interrogate themselves about how much of that ideology they themselves have bought into. I think there's a lot of people who essentially their gripe is, I don't have that power. Man, I wish I had that power, and then I could use the ring of power for good. Of course, everyone feels that temptation, that pull. Oh, if only I could be in charge, or if only the people I like could be in charge, then everything would be so much better. Again, I think this is a really fundamental battle that we have to fight internally, consciously, against even our own tendencies to want to control other people. And again, I think there's many different ways in which we can make that argument. There is the moral argument. There's also a pragmatic argument, because as I say, central planning does not work. You cannot manage human activity, the human flourishing, and have a productive society. You can manage it and have a bunch of automatons that are essentially going to end up devolving into a complete chaos state. But you cannot actively manage humanity. And until we understand that and truly believe it, not just say it, but really understand and believe it at our core, then nothing will change. Because as I say, get rid of the head of the Hydra, there will be a million people tomorrow who would be absolutely lusting over those seats of power.
Mm-hmm. I had a question here about the roundtable group. People call it the Milner group. The main person there that they talk about is Cecil Rhodes. What was I going to say? Yeah, are they still central to this movement today?
I would say the historical linkage of the actual people involved in that. I do not believe that they are still ones in positions of power pulling strings. I think the group itself was always somewhat amorphous, and partly that was part of the way it was set up. So for people who don't know, Cecil Rhodes was a Rothschild made man, who made his fortune in diamonds and essentially use that wealth as a leverage point for political power and political agenda, which from Rhodes' perspective, he was trying to promote the British Empire and the rule of the British Empire over the whole world. And so he formed a secret society in order to further those goals. And this is, again, it sounds, to people who don't know, it sounds, oh, that's crazy conspiracy. No, this is actual documented history. Look it up. In fact, we have the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes. He had 6 different wills that were being stewarded over by William T. Stead that have been published. You can go read them on archive.org right now, in which he talked about it. There were New York Times, I believe, articles that I cited in my World War I documentary at that time, talking about this secret society that Cecil Rhodes had founded. But the way that he set it up, quite consciously, he set it up on the model of the Jesuits. Because he thought, well, here's an organization that's persisted for centuries and has political power. Why don't we be like them? So he set it up in that way.
And G. Edward Griffin gave this incredibly important talk that I've cited many times because I think it really clearly articulates the sort of the nature of what that group was and how it operated. He called it the rings within rings, which is the idea of you have, as Cecil Rhodes set up, there is this inner core called the Society of the Elect, who would be the real core of this group. And then you'd have people around them who would be told a certain story about what this group is and what they're doing. And then you'd have people around them who would be drawn into this larger organization. And so you have these rings within rings, but only the people in the Society of the Elect, only the absolute core of this group really know what the group is and what it's aimed at and what it's doing. And that's why this particular roundtable society was so influential and so important, certainly in turn of the 20th into early 20th century world politics. And for people who want sort of the inner gritty workings of what they did, who the literal names of these people, who they were connected to, what they actually did, I would highly suggest Carroll Quigley. And if you don't want to tackle the 800-page Tragedy and Hope, which is a pretty big book, there's a rather slim Anglo-American establishment book that he wrote that talks about this group and the sorts of things that they were doing, specifically in the run-up to World War I, and then in the run-up to World War II. This was, as Carroll Quigley said, it was probably the most powerful force in the world that most people hadn't heard of at that point in the mid-20th century. Those particular people and their offspring, I don't think this was sort of the intergenerational thing that some other secret societies may be. So I would need a lot more evidence presented that particular group persisted, but the organizations that group created persisted. The Council on Foreign Relations in the United States is a creation of that group. The Royal Institute for International Affairs. There's a version of that in every one of the crown countries, essentially, and in non-crown countries like the United States. And those groups have inordinate amounts of power in the foreign policy space and continue to have that power. So that is one way you could look at sort of the legacy of that roundtable group that still persists to this day. I just don't think it's necessarily the same people or the same families running that.
Right. So I was going to ask as well, concerning the royalty, like the monarchy you mentioned, the British, I was going to ask about the Vatican as well, because you mentioned the what is it, the circles within circles?
Yeah, the Jesuit order.
Yeah. Is the Vatican like involved in this, or was that just a coincidence? And do they, because I know the kings say they have a divine right to rule. Like,
right.
What do they believe, like, in the church? Are they like given that by the church?
Right. Well, there's always, I mean, you could go back thousands of years talking about the tensions between royalty and the spiritual power, and the Catholic Church obviously having been an integral part of that in European history. But yes, are elements of the Vatican and certain offshoots and groups and the Jesuits and the P2 Masonic Lodge and other weird things happening in Rome, are those sorts of groups associated with this grander conspiracy? Absolutely so. And one way that has been framed in the past, I know that people have talked about the empires of the city, and talking about the city of London, which is different than London. The square mile, the city of London, is the sort of bankster heart of London, which is actually its own separate area, and I believe even the Prime Minister has to ask permission in order to enter the city of London, that square mile. And there's all this weird ritual stuff around that. The Vatican, again, Vatican City, which is its own state. And you actually cross the border when you go from Rome into Vatican City. And Washington, D.C., I think, was the other empire of the city that was talked about in that regard. So there's definitely a nexus there. And as I say, if we go back to this fundamental ideology of power and control, then yes, that's something I've pointed out many, many times. This is the sort of the foundational mythos of royalty itself. Why does royalty exist? Why are there families that just by virtue of their blood are fit to rule over entire nations? It's because way back, if you want to go far enough back, the Egyptian emperors were literally worshipped as gods. Ra is a god on Earth. This is a god. In fact, here in Japan, the emperor has traditionally been thought of as a descendant of the gods, and there are people who are crazy enough, I guess, to believe that to this day, that this is a literal god on Earth.
North Korea as well. The current
Yeah,
North
well,
Korean.
there's crazy. I remember reading crazy stories that are taught about not Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Un, no, Kim Song Il, the founder, and how he could walk through walls, and how he just all this crazy stuff that's attributed to him. Yes, it's ridiculous to us, right? Because we are enlightened. We know we're 21st century guys. We don't fall for that nonsense. But I think that's exactly why that very old ideology, which again literally used to be kings are gods. They are literal gods, and then it became the divine right to rule. No, God has given the power to this ruler to rule over the people, and then that gets devolved or evolved or whatever into democracy itself, because now it's like, no, there's sort of this nebulous power of the people, and the people get to invest that power at times in certain different people. And yeah, there's still this royalty, but they're not really ruling anything. Just don't look at how much money they actually have, or any of their actual holdings, or any of their actual political influence. That's not important. And then it kind of morphs into this 19th century conception, which I've identified many times. Eugenics is that old divine right of rule, but it's sort of morphed into the new speak of the post-enlightenment, in which now we're in this scientific era where we need some sort of scientific rationale for the reason why there are these groups that are fit to rule. Is it because God appointed them? No, it's because their genes are better than yours, and so they get the right to do what they want with you. Essentially, is the ultimate push of the eugenicists. And it's difficult for us to understand it today because most people don't even know the word eugenics anymore. But back in early 20th century, I should say, it was absolutely the science that everyone was talking about. It was a big deal, and anyone who was anyone was an avowed eugenicist, like the way anyone who's anyone is an avowed climate change, global warming, oh my God, we're all going to die because of carbon dioxide believer these days. You had to at least give lip service to eugenics back in the early 20th century. And that shaped so much of early 20th century progressive politics, the idea of the state as essentially stewarding humanity through cultivation of the good genes into some sort of future utopia. And it always carries with it the dark shadow of what the eugenicists always try to distance themselves from, which is dysgenics. The idea that with eugenics, okay, promote the good genes in society and hope that rich and prosperous people have many children so that they can have big families. The other side of that is dysgenics. Well, these people have defective genes. These people are criminals. They're poor. They just have defective protoplasm, as it was called back in the time, because they didn't even know what it was. And so, what do you do with them? You sterilize them, and eventually you start thinking about killing them. Because, do we really need all these defectives, all these mentally defective people? No, we need to start getting rid of them. And that, of course, that's exactly what happened in the early 20th century.
That leads into my next question I had. Who was Bill Gates Sr., and what did he have to do with eugenics and Planned Parenthood?
Excellent questions, and ones that have been obfuscated because they're Planned Parenthood's board and who has served on them and in what capacity for what time is not generally publicly searchable information. So we have to take this from various sources. But I'm going to go off of memory. It's been 3 years now since I created my Bill Gates documentary at corbettreport.com/Gates. So I believe it is from Bill Gates Sr.'s own autobiography or memoir of sorts that he wrote, where he admitted that he was on the board of Planned Parenthood. So that's confirmed. Bill Gates himself said that on a PBS interview back, I believe, in the 90s or very early 2000s. So that information is out there. Anyway, more to the point, I think is the other sorts of revelations that Bill Gates Sr. made in that memoir that he wrote. I wish I could remember the name of it off the top of my head, but anyway, it is cited in my Gates documentary. And in that book, he explicitly said that the Gates, when him and Bill were coming up with this idea for this foundation and how they could use their wealth, productively, blah blah blah, the group that they looked to that was the template for everything they were doing in the space was the Rockefeller family. And of course, it's exactly it. You had Rockefeller with his oil monopoly and the unimaginable wealth that was amassed from that. You can say he was the world's first billionaire, but that doesn't mean anything to us today. Oh, $1 billion, that's not something. No, $1 billion back in 1910 is unimaginable wealth, absolutely incredible. And how did they steer and take that wealth, which was beginning to make the Rockefellers deeply unpopular with many people? How did they take that and shape it into we're going to put it into philanthropy and we're going to go into public health and these other spaces and start to completely shape and control the world in our favor, but people will love us because it's got the Rockefeller name on all these public institutions. And Bill Gates Sr. specifically said, we were using the Rockefellers. They were there. Whatever we were thinking of, they were already there first. So we just modeled ourselves on them. Yeah, I think that's exactly it, because it's a template for how to turn monetary wealth into political power.
Mm-hmm. So there was an article about billionaires meeting in, I think, New York to discuss overpopulation, and it had like Warren Buffett, Ted Turner, and Bill Gates. I know you've mentioned about overpopulation. I think actually, yeah, can you just explain that? Is that real? And why are they all, are they just showing us that they are eugenicists?
Yes. Okay, so you are referring to the Good Club, which I believe was being reported on in 2009, if memory serves. Anyway, again, that is cited in my documentary as well. And I will always remember it because there was this ridiculous ABC News propaganda piece that they put out about the super friends. So in order to dumb this down for the public that they think are literal children, they put it in the form of cartoons and say, hey, this Good Club that was meeting of these rich billionaires is like the super friends. And they're showing these cartoon stuff and just dumbing it down to a ridiculous degree. So that always sticks in my mind. But you're exactly right. There was a meeting at, it was in New York, I believe, at a Rockefeller residence. David Rockefeller was there, and maybe it was at Rockefeller University. At any rate, Bill Gates, Ted Turner, Oprah Winfrey was there. Other esteemed billionaires were in the crowd, and the way that it was sold to the public was these billionaires are coming together to find out how they can put their wealth to the benefit of planet Earth. What's the best thing they could do? And of course, one of the things they hit on was population reduction. Yes, they could love the Earth by killing more humans. Of course, they wouldn't quite say it that way, at least not in their public PR, but that is the gist of it, because this entire overpopulation myth that has been sold to the public, it really stretches back centuries now. You could trace it back to Thomas Malthus, the British parson who was in the employ of the British East India Company, if I remember correctly, who wrote the essay on population, basically screaming his head off there at the end of the 18th century about, oh my God, population is increasing exponentially, but food is increasing arithmetically. So we're going to run out of food, and basically predicting within a generation there was going to be all this famine and everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. That same prediction has been made now for, well, over 2 centuries, and it's signally failed to come true every single generation for over 200 years now, and yet people still continue to push it. And one of the recent variations of that was from the 1960s. There was a huge hype about the population bomb, as Paul Ehrlich famously put it in his book, that, oh my God, by the year 2000, where the entire world is going to be suffering from famines and droughts, and all it's going to be horrible, and too many people. Of course, again, signally failed to come true. It was complete. Every single prediction Ehrlich made was absolutely bonkers, off the wall, totally, demonstrably, provably untrue. But he's still lauded as some great figure in the annals of science, as if he's contributed anything to the demographic field of study. People want more on that. Go to CorbettReport.com/Ehrlich, EHRLICH, and you'll find out more about his illustrious career. But that's the reason that idea, that the demonstrably wrong idea, continues to be forwarded every generation, is because that is a perfect tool, a leverage of control over the population. Because what does that mean? Population control. I mean, obviously that is sold to us as, controlling the numbers of people in the population so that we can live in harmony with the planet or whatever. But I think they mean it very literally, controlling the population in every sense, what you can do, who you can interact with, where you can go. If they can limit you in some way, then they can contain essentially your human productive activity and try to box it up. So that is why the overpopulation narrative continues to be sold to the public. It is a narrative. It is wrong. I've talked about this many, many, many times. Yes, the population is increasing, and it will presumably continue to increase until, even as the UN admits, by the point you get around 9 billion, it'll start to level off, and then it'll start to decline. But, oh, by the way, did you know sperm counts are absolutely plunging, not just in North America, as people were reporting several years ago, but no, literally everywhere around the world. Sperm rates are absolutely plunging, as 50% plus in various studies. That seems like something that we should know about, that we might want to figure into this overpopulation doom-mongering that goes on. And why are the billionaires of the world so concerned about this particular idea and this threat? It's because, again, this is a perfect leverage point for their eugenical beliefs. Because, again, there's only so much space for all these people on the planet. We might as well, make sure that we're preserving the good people, and we'll let the poor people rot on all of this. But that's the way the good club operates.
So do people in this good club, do they actually believe that other people are so inferior that that the planets, they don't believe that the resources are limited and the planet's going to burn up? They don't really believe that, but do they believe that other people are so inferior that they have the right to just kill them off until what point? Till there's only them left, or to what end?
Well, look, I mean, anything I would say here would be speculative in a sense, but I would say informed speculation because it comes from research. I can't speak for the inner thoughts or workings of the minds of these people, but I can say about their public record, and what they say at every opportunity is that the threat of the growing human population is what they consistently cite as the greatest threat. But threat to whom, and threat to what, and threat in what way? Why is more people a threat? And unfortunately, again, this is another case in which I think most people in the audience probably agree. Yeah, too many people? There probably are too many people. We need to get rid of some. They have been indoctrinated into this cult without even knowing it, to the point where they start spewing the propaganda. And when someone like a Julian Simon comes along and points out that actually the greatest resource, the ultimate resource we have on this planet is humans. The human brain, human ingenuity. The more people who are born, the more geniuses and inventors and entrepreneurs are going to come along and solve the problems that present themselves. So it's a good thing to have more people on this planet. But that is such a ridiculed idea. And some people will absolutely fight tooth and nail against that concept. It just goes to show, as I was saying, I don't think this is necessarily simply a fight against they, them, those people out there. It's a fight internally. I think a lot of people have already lost the battle in their own mind because they've bought into the enemy propaganda.
Yeah, I think their propaganda is essentially to have human beings care less and less about each other until, basically you see people getting hurt in the street and you just walk past it. But I was also just going to touch upon this article. Bill Gates is bankrolling a company that is using $1 billion initial equity allocation from investors to plan a network of satellites to provide real-time coverage of almost every location on Earth. The company Earth Now plans to launch an army of more than 500 satellites into our atmosphere, providing its users, governments, and large enterprises with near instantaneous video feedback with only 1 second of delay. I just wanted to touch on that. I mean, Bill Gates is going to watch
Yes.
it.
This is one of those nexus points where you start to see the various agendas come together, because one thing that unites all of these various agendas and players is the idea of control. But how do you exert control? It is through surveillance. Having total data and knowledge of everything that's taking place in the world at all times is a pretty good way to start if you're going to start trying to control everything that's taking place on the earth. So I think the surveillance grid is an incredibly important part of that. And specifically this satellite reconnaissance idea that Gates is helping to fund. We arrive at that from a few different propaganda vectors, one of which is the idea of the Paris Accords that was signed several years ago. And, we've got to limit carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions in order to prevent the Earth from warming more than 2 degrees Celsius. And just don't ask how they arrived at that 2 degrees Celsius, because it was totally, completely arbitrary, plucked out of thin air. But hey, whatever, details, schmetails. Anyway, how will they actually, before they can even enforce those sorts of things, how are you going to have some sort of global emission pledge or something? How are you going to enforce that? Well, you'd have to, at the very least, be able to accurately detail and count everyone's emissions, right? And how are you going to do that? Well, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had this satellite system in place that was monitoring all emissions on the planet all the time? And so that's one of the propaganda vectors that has been floated. And it just so happens that Gates is also funding that very technology. And then you had this bizarre propaganda a few years ago during the Super Bowl. And I for a couple of years, I did this video about, I watched the Super Bowl commercials, so you don't have to. And one of the ones that I remember from 2020, 2019 or 2020, was from Microsoft. And it was about this system that they're going to introduce, this AI surveillance monitoring grid system that they bragged was going to measure everything about nature, including the length of every blade of grass in the forest and all of this, which again, I think speaks to the sort of, I guess, almost autistic mindset, I think, of some of these central planners who really do I think, probably believe themselves to be capable of controlling everything that's happening on the planet, but only if we can organize and measure and collect and analyze and categorize everything that's happening on the planet. And that's one of those strange urges that you see from these people over and over and over again throughout history. The person who founded eugenics was Francis Galton, who's celebrated as a polymath. He did all sorts of things. He was into meteorology and biology and physics and science and math and all this stuff. But one of the things that was noted about him was that he was always trying to catalog and note down and analyze everything in systematic ways. And that's why he was so good at, say, meteorology. Today we'll record the exact temperature and barometer readings and the positions of the clouds and everything. And if we do that every single day, then we can see the patterns, and then we can construct these ideas of how weather is changing and blah, blah, blah. It's that kind of mindset, which also was the mindset that got Francis Galton involved in, everyone has unique fingerprints. And so we could actually take recordings of everyone's fingerprints, and then we could start analyzing them to see if criminals are more likely to have certain shapes or patterns in their fingerprints. Like, this is the literal we're fingerprinting from the police. Where did that come from? Well, it's a nice handy identifier, but literally the person who was pioneering that, which became the entire field of biometrics, was Francis Galton, this insane eugenics-obsessed person. It's this idea of cataloging, categorizing, analyzing, recording everything on the planet, which is part of this control freak nature.
Mm-hmm. And I was just going to mention about you talk about technocracy, and well, usually my mind always goes to like Elon Musk and Neuralink, and I think like eventually in the future you're gonna have to have it, or else it's like you can't enter. You're crazy. You're probably like a rapist or something. So I mean, what is the future like? I mean, that's obviously they want to control. Why wouldn't they just want to control you at your mind and like see what you're thinking, like filter you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's where this goes, because once you've cataloged the sort of exterior of the world, then you have to start cataloging the interior, and you have to start knowing about and then ultimately controlling and manipulating the inner life of every single person on the planet. And that is obviously part of this agenda. So you're exactly right. I think Elon Musk and Neuralink and the brain chips is an incredibly important part of this, because people will tend, certainly in my audience, people will tend to dismiss and poo-poo that, oh, they can't really do that kind of stuff. That's sci-fi, it's all malarkey. Well, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be slightly better than not having a brain chip in you that can, in some way, direct certain intentions or even just to manipulate your mood or your emotional level. Could be the type of control that could literally sway humanity one way or another once enough people accept this technology. And it goes back to, unfortunately, again, part of the problem. We always want to say it's they, them, they're doing this to us. Meanwhile, almost every single person listening to this conversation has a smartphone in their pocket that they paid for with their own money to some corporation, so so they can surveil and track and database everything you're doing. We are playing into this system, and until we understand our culpability and responsibility for that, I don't think we can adequately confront this at the root of where we need to in order to really unroot this agenda.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna ask one question here about Event 201. Do you know about Event 201? I heard Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talking about it, describing how the CIA was there, like the big tech companies were there, and like they had like a bunch of the plans that got more totalitarian. Well, why do they do that in public?
It's an excellent question. So I think there could be a number of different reasons. For people who don't know, please do look it up. Event 201, which was held in October of 2019, just at the time that whatever they say was starting to spread in Wuhan was presumably starting to spread before it started to get noticed, or whatever timeline they're trying to throw out. Anyway, at that exact time, they're having an event, this biosecurity preparation event that was co-hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Public Security, or whatever fancy name they give themselves, and involved a fictional scenario of a novel coronavirus pandemic spreading around the world, and how they would deal with that. So they had this tabletop exercise, and they go through it. And I think it's still, the last time I checked, it was online for you to view that exercise, and there was 6 hours of it that I did watch at the time. It's interesting in retrospect, isn't it? Once you know that, oh, they're preparing for something that presumably they're ginning into existence here. Why would they do that is an excellent question. And I think, again, there's a few different reasons. One, I think, is simply to prepare the public consciousness to accept the reality of the events that they are then being presented with. If you are drilled and presented with this idea, okay, this is the emergency we're preparing for. We're preparing for this. We're preparing for this. We're preparing for this. Then when it happens, it doesn't feel so out of left field. You're not like, oh my God, what is this? You're like, oh yes, well, we were expecting this. So again, it's a nice way to prepare people, but perhaps more specifically, because most of people in the general public in October 2019 didn't know of the existence of Event 201 and weren't following it. I mean, it was live streamed, I believe, but probably had about 3 people watching it, because who would watch that? But the people participating in those events are probably the primary targets of that propaganda. The head of the CDC and people like that, the head of the Chinese CDC was there, who are the public officials who absolutely will have power and responsibilities and key roles in when this event actually becomes reality, whatever that means exactly in this case. When that actually starts to happen, these people will already, in a sense, be trained in what to do and how to do it, and also what threats to look out for. Because one of the things that came up in that tabletop exercise was, people are spreading misinformation about this novel coronavirus pandemic. So how do we deal with that? And some countries are going to shut down the internet entirely to stop the spread. And, maybe we don't want to go that far, but how should we censor? And can we censor? Those sorts of conversations get raised and broached in this safe, fictional environment that then becomes reality several months later. And those officials who are now in positions to actually do these things have already, again, been mentally prepared
for the events as they start to take place.
All right, so I have a couple of rapid fire truth bombs. This is a little section because I know we're a little short on time. So I was gonna ask a bunch of questions here. Who is Klaus Schwab, and like who really is above him? I mean, you don't have to answer the first part, but who's above Klaus Schwab?
Who's above him? I don't think he's even particularly important. I think he's more of a creation. So, for example, Johnny Vedmore, I believe, has done some research on Klaus Schwab, so showing that the World Economic Forum was simply a creation, an adjunct of Henry Kissinger and the sort of people that Schwab name checks as his mentors. So I don't think Schwab actually holds any power really in the oligarchy. It's just that he's a very good carnival barker barking a very old tale about a new world order that we could have if we'll call it a great reset. And so he's essentially just come up with new branding for an old idea.
So then I wrote one about World War One. I think people should really look at your documentary about it. But basically, it wasn't that Ferdinand guy that got shot that started it, was it? Like,
No. Well, yes, I suppose, but no. And that's one of those things because if you want to look at the flashpoint that sets off something that happened, I guess, yes, that was a flashpoint and it did set off a series of events. But how do you understand what happened there and how it became what it became? It's obviously a bigger story. And we could say that about anything that takes place. Because again, there are people who get hung up on, say, 9/11 as the events that took place on the morning of September 11th, 2001. And that's all that they think about. And that's all they look at in that. But no, this was a decades-long story involving all these different people and all these things coming together at that moment as sort of a nexus point. But if you only look at that nexus point, you do not understand the full story.
And my next one was about Pearl Harbor. I just wanted to ask, did the U.S. know about the Japanese that they were going to come and they just let it happen, or is that true?
Yes, they did. And I've talked about that before. In fact, I interviewed Robert Stinnett before he passed away. I can't remember the name of his book, but he wrote one of the cardinal books researching that issue. He was a U.S. naval officer who became interested in the issue decades later and wrote a book about it. And Day of Deception, I believe, was the name of that book. There's a lot of info about that that's been released, even from the NSA archives, about what they knew and what they, the way it was covered up. It's an entire story, but yes, I think the U.S. Certain elements in FDR's cabinet certainly did know.
Yeah, a lot of these things, like, you're not going to get the full story from this podcast, so like, do your own research, like everybody recommends, and come to your own conclusions. So the nuking of Japan, how the Japan got nuked. Was it necessary? I thought I've heard stories that the Japanese surrendered before, like a couple weeks or something.
Yes. Again, this is there's a lot to be said about this, and I know that Dan Carlin of Hardcore History had a series about this, the sort of the madness that led to that thing. And there's a lot of ways to try to justify and explain, and you had to understand the politics of the time, etc. But ultimately, yes, Japanese were at the point of surrender, and in fact, much like World War I, was deliberately prolonged. And there's an entire book about that called "Prolonging the Agony" that people should look into, where basically they were trying to twist the screws and to Germany as a way of punishing them essentially for the war and to further cripple them, which was if you watch my World War I documentary, was the real point of World War I. And World War II, again, I think the agony was prolonged in a sense, and then the bombs were absolutely not necessary, completely not necessary. But I think most people these days would at the very least understand, it was a message to the Soviet Union, because now they were drawing new battle lines for the coming Cold War, right? Which is I mean, look in the face of the families of the 100,000 people who were instantly vaporized in the blink of an eye and say, but we had to do it to prove a lesson to the Soviet Union or something. I mean, those are the types of monsters, the absolute psychopathic monsters that we are dealing with. And anyone who would justify that on the basis of geopolitics are not part of the human family. Let's put it that way.
Edward Griffin mentioned that similar thing, that these people, that he doesn't even think they're human. He doesn't consider them human because, I mean, maybe to be a human you have to like care about other people and like not be out there to murder them. So he also mentioned that he thinks that there's an occult group that worships the devil that's at the center of this. Uh, what do you like? What is public about that?
Well, there are a number of secret societies that have existed throughout time and are just historical record. We don't have to speculate about it. And we've already cited some of them. I mean, the Jesuit order is a type of secret society that wasn't so secret, but operated in secret ways. I think a lot of people would be surprised about its real history. But look at the Illuminati, which was a real organization that really existed, and the founding fathers in the United States wrote about it. George Washington wrote about it in his letters, and I mean, there was a real Illuminati, and unfortunately, that gets dumbed down into modern conspiracy culture, or sort of the dumbed down mainstream version of it, of everything is Illuminati. But I think there really is a group that certainly does participate in and believe in these, what I would consider to be wacky, magical beliefs about the energies that they can get through child sacrifice and what have you. It's absolutely, I mean, again, it's off the wall, unbelievable stuff. Unless you started to look into it, and people like I'm going to forget his name, John DeCamp, looking at the Franklin scandal, and when you look into the Epstein scandal, and you look into things like this, the absolutely inhuman, monstrous things that keep coming up as a result of this. Clearly, there are people who believe they get some sort of spiritual energy out of feeding off of fear and adrenochrome and those sorts of things. That doesn't mean that that's actually real or that you have to believe it. But I think there are people in positions of power who do actually believe that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Really quick. So we have an hour, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm gonna ask. I want to skip to the. I had a bunch of questions about 9/11, but obviously you did a bunch of uh, documentaries. I like the War Games one, the Suspects. I think I watched all of them. And yeah, basically, I think if people don't know about the TV show, the Lone Gunman, that's pretty crazy. Like what?
Yeah.
That's like, because you mentioned the predictive programming.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you look up the Lone Gunman and read the pilot episode, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And then I just wanted to ask about 9/11. What happened to the planes that crashed into the towers? I guess you were saying that they were possibly remote controlled because there's no way two rookie pilots could do that maneuver. How does somebody remote control a plane? Did they land those other planes? Because I know there was like some operation that they were trying to do in the past, like, but they didn't do it or something like.
Yes, that's right. Right.
But
So Operation Northwoods from the 1960s was a plan to stage terror attacks and blame them on Cuba as to justify an invasion of Cuba at that time. And one of the plans that they forwarded in that plan, that was signed off on by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, waiting on Kennedy's desk for his signature, would have been operationalized. But thankfully, he didn't sign off on it. Instead, he fired Lemnitzer from the Chiefs of Staff, and probably signed his own death warrant as a result of it. One of their plans was to essentially stage this entire thing, and there were different ways that they could do it. For example, holding some sort of contest where students would win a trip to South America, and then they would just populate the passenger list of that. Oh, here are the winners, and here they go off on their trip, and it would be well publicized, and they would have the passenger list, who would all be CIA agents essentially, and then they would fly that plane off and then land it at an Air Force base, and at the same time as they're taking off essentially a drone that was designed to look like that plane, and then they would fly that over Cuba, blow it up in midair, while broadcasting Mayday messages, we're under attack, and use that as the justification. Again, sounds crazy, but that's what they were saying. This is not the plan I was coming up with. So we know those plans exist. We also know interesting information about the radar gaps in which all of the hijackings on 9/11 took place. During these
top secret. You're not supposed to know about them, but there are these gaps in the radar penetration of the homeland United States. The continental U.S. has these radar gaps where they're not able to track the plane in that particular moment, essentially. And every single one of these hijackings apparently took place in those radar gaps. Or at any rate, I am summarizing a conversation I had a decade ago with a researcher who did this, and I don't even recall his name off the top of my head, but people can look in my archives for that. So we know there's some very suspicious things just about even the timing and the way that these things happened over various Air Force bases and what have you. We also know about remote control plane technology, which people might think is a relatively new thing, but it has been around for a while. In fact, it stretches back to the 1940s. They were doing things like Operation Aphrodite, which was remote controlled planes that they were testing out during World War II. That's how John F. Kennedy's older brother, Joseph Kennedy Jr., died, was in Operation Aphrodite. So people can look that up. They've been testing remote controlled aircraft for a long time. And there are various companies that were piloting and testing and had various stages of announced and unannounced development in that field at the time of 9/11, to the point where it's not an admitted. You're not going to find the sort of the official document saying yes, this totally would have been possible, but it would have been possible on 9/11 to remotely hijack and steer commercial airliners. And in fact, it wouldn't have even been particularly difficult to do something like that. The internal guidance systems of these commercial jets have things like the Twin Towers programmed into them as a way of obviously avoiding those types of obvious perils. But the internal guidance systems could be easily reset, as that could be a waypoint in which essentially the plane is steering towards it. I also did a video called "How to Steal an Airplane," I believe was the name of the video I did several years ago. It's all about that, the remote controlled technologies that existed, the people like Dov Zakheim, the controller of the Pentagon, and his investments in those companies. One of the people responsible for finding the $2.3 trillion that went missing shortly before 9/11. And I also talked to Aidan Monahan, who is a researcher who did a lot of work on this particular topic and looking at the ways that the planes were turning and how their maneuvers would not have been possible, even by trained pilots, let alone by complete novices who had never actually sat in a cockpit before.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what do you think about the Jehovah Witnesses and how they have a belief on the United Nations? Do you know about that?
Vaguely. I do not know a whole lot about that, but I'd be interested to hear more.
It's very funny. I mean, you could probably, I think they have a Wikipedia page on this exact topic, and then like it's controversy, but
well, no, I could say from my perspective here in Japan, the very interesting thing about the assassination of Abe that took place this past year is that it has revealed this conspiracy that is now starting to come to light, where they're now admitting hundreds and hundreds of Japanese Diet Parliament members have these connections to the Moonies, the Unification Church, or whatever they're calling themselves now. And it turns out there's this huge influence that exists and has been going on for decades between this culty church and Japanese parliamentarians, and it's suddenly coming out. But unfortunately, no one in the West is interested, because it's like, oh, well, I thought the Illuminati or Klaus Schwab killed Abe or something, but oh, it's just the Moonies. Who cares?
Mm-hmm. So if people want to learn more about the Jehovah Witness, they could look it up. They basically believe the United Nations is like the devil, like. And they could also look into Christian anarchism. There's a Wikipedia page on that. They basically believe the same thing, that only God is the authority. So my final question, I kind of just wanted to ask you about anarchism. If there's no longer a law and order system set up by governments to deter crimes from happening, what principles do humans have to live by to make it all work?
All right. So one good question, as always, to ask when the question comes up, how would it work without government doing this? Is how did it work before government did this? Because people have to understand that almost every sort of institution and system and structure that we take for granted today didn't exist even a century or two ago. So how did people do it back in the olden days? And one of the things that is one of the great cultural heritages of people like myself, who my family and my roots are from England. And so the English common law system was this wonderful system that developed over the course of centuries and centuries and centuries, where essentially over time, enough judges ruling on various disputes that are taking place and things that are happening, you start to accumulate this sort of, okay, this is our culture, and this is what we accept, and this is what we do not accept, and this is how it, and there's no person standing over that process saying, this is the law. We write down this on a piece of paper and it becomes the law. It's no, there are people arbitrating these disputes over long periods of time, and it starts to accumulate into this body that becomes this common law. And that can change and it can morph over time, because it isn't written down on some tablet or something, and that, or it's not penned down by some authority. That's one way we can start to conceptualize how law and order still can exist without a government. I know this blows people's minds every time I say it, but yes, there can be decentralized ways of coming up with and establishing and even enforcing law and order. And you can have, oh my God, competing enforcement agencies, instead of saying, no, there must be this one monopolistic enforcement agency that we put all our eggs in that basket, and then whatever they do and whatever happens, well, the only possible answer is to just give them more money and more power. And because what else are you going to do? You can't possibly have competing enforcement agencies, so that we could say, hey, those guys are absolutely corrupt to the bone. I'm not going to go with them. I'm going to go with these. And then you're going to have the usual counter arguments to that argument of, oh, well, then eventually the enforcement agency that becomes the biggest will just become a monopoly, and it'll just become a government, which I guess one way of at least needling people who have that counter argument is to say, so let me get this straight. Your biggest problem with the idea of abolishing government is that it might lead to the formation of another government? Well, what is it that you're defending exactly? It's like the people who come along and say that people are corrupt and you can't trust people, and people are evil. So we should appoint a bunch of people in order to rule over the other people, in order to not get the corrupt people to extort the corrupt people, but we have to extort people in order to pay the people to rule over the other people. It's total nonsense. But again, like the overpopulation propaganda that people have bought into, it's the government propaganda that people have bought into. There's just no other way to possibly imagine human relations other than to have a certain group of people who are selected by a ballot once every 4 years in order to rule over however many hundreds of millions of other people. It's nonsense, but until we start to really interrogate that nonsense, I don't know how we'll be able to step out of it.
Yeah, I think like Ron Paul says, the truth will, I mean, just put your ideas out there and the truth eventually rises to the top. So I don't think you could really defend controlling other people just because you voted. And like, what if you're like 49%? Like, now the other 49% has to be controlled by other people. So it really makes no sense. So yeah, I mean, if that's all the time we have, I want to thank you for coming on this show and spreading all your ideas.
I very much appreciated the conversation, and I hope we can talk again in the future.
Yep, hope so as well. Thank you. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you. Take care.